Hi, welcome everyone to another tutorial, and this time around we'll take a look at how you can use the Windows Remote Desktop tool to connect to a Linux desktop. There are several other options. So for example, you could use tools like VNC and tools such as tight VNC, for example, the client and the server, to do something very similar. However, in this tutorial, we'll take a look at using the Windows Remote Desktop solution. Fact being that as a client, it's a default on all Windows systems, so you don't have to install anything special on your desktop. So let's get started. So the various steps involved in the tutorial. Number one is if you are running on a Linux server without the GUI, of course, we'll have to install the GUI. If you're already running the full-blown Linux desktop, then of course you can skip step one. Step two is to install the XRDP application service, and then finally step three, it's very dependent on the version of Ubuntu that you're using. The Unity desktop interface in version 14 is not really compatible with XRDP, so it does require us to use a different desktop environment such as XFCE, so that it does allow for remote desktop. And then finally is to make sure that when you do use XRDP, it does point to XFCE for the remote session. So broadly, these are the four steps that are required before you can connect to a Windows desktop, I'm sorry, a Linux desktop through Windows RDP. All right, so let's get started. So step number one is to connect to your Linux environment. So in my case, I've started off with without the GUI interface, so I'm connected to a remote server. So let's actually start installing. So just a quick check again to know which version of the operating system I'm currently running. So SB underscore release. So just a quick check on the release. So I am using the Ubuntu server operating system version 14.04 LTS version. So the first thing we'll need to do is to run the desktop. Now, installing the desktop can take a long time, so I've done this in advance of the video. So this is the command that you need to run. Basically, it installs the Ubuntu desktop. It does give you quite many of the tools and solutions that you will need. So I've installed the full version of the desktop. There are parameters here that you can apply so that you install the bare minimum, because the default, if you just install Ubuntu-desktop, it does give you a lot of the other applications like the OpenOffice application and several others which you may or may not need. So do run that first. In the interest of time, I've done that in advance. It typically takes about 20 minutes, again depending on the client machine or the hardware that you're throwing at it, plus your internet speed and various other parameters. So it should take you anywhere between say 15 to 30 minutes to install the desktop. Once you have installed the desktop, the next step is, of course, you will want to run apt get update, sudo apt get update. Yeah. Make sure, sorry, Ubuntu is already updated before we run the next step, which is to install XRDP. Install and XRDP. Yep, it's reasonably small download, so I didn't have to do it in advance of the video. Alright, so we're good there, and for good measure, let's just run update again. All right, so that's it for step one and two. Again, if you already have a desktop GUI installed on Ubuntu, you could have skipped step one and went straight to step two. Now we need, sorry, we need to install XFCE. Again, the reason we are doing that is, again, the Unity desktop, which is the default in Ubuntu, is not compatible with XRDP. I think it used to be, but in the more recent version, since version 14, it isn't. So we will use a different desktop environment, such as XFCE. XFCE is a very lightweight desktop interface. So let's go ahead and install that. XFCE. All right. And again, it's a fairly small download, so I didn't install it in advance of recording the video. So it should just take about maybe a minute or two. So while that's going ahead, oh, all right, it's already done. Looks like my internet's really good today. All right, so we have done installing XFCE. The next thing is to let XRDP, the session, know that you want to use XFCE as the default. So for that, we'll create a file, echo XFCE4 session, and we'll create the file to root. Yep, so that should do it. All right, that just tells XRDP that it needs to use XFCE anytime it's connected to the server using RDP. All right, so that's about it. Last thing you'll want to make sure is that the the XRDP service has been restarted. So XRDP, oops, XRDP, and restart the service. All right, that's about it. So we are all good to go. So let's actually fire up a remote desktop and let's run a session. All right, so here I've got the Windows remote desktop, pointed it to the server. If I click on connect, yep, it's just swap Windows. All right, and here I'm gonna log in. You definitely don't want to use the root account, so best practice is to create a different account which you'll use for logging in. So I'm just using all the defaults and keeping things really simple. So as you can see, I've used the Windows remote desktop tool to log in into a Linux-based environment. So behind the scene, it's actually running the Ubuntu operating system using XFCE as the desktop environment. So it does give you pretty much the same kind of like access as running it locally. Again, there could be a minor lag, but that can be understandable. I did point out earlier that if you did install the Ubuntu desktop, it does install the complete default applications, and there are parameters so you could use to to install a much leaner, lighter version of the desktop. All right, hope the video's been helpful, and look forward to seeing you on the next video. Thanks, everyone.